Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jenny Parks, and I'm the Vice President of Policy and Research at MHEC, the Midwestern Higher Education Compact. Thank you for joining us today for what has been a very productive series of webinars this spring for us, and we assume will continue to be a very productive topic for webinars in the future. Today's webinar is Continuing Enrollments in Professional Licensure Programs after July 1st. As you all know, we have some federal regs that are going into effect July 1st, and there are a lot of things that folks at the institutional level need to do to remain in compliance for Title IV funding and with other requirements from the Federal Department of Ed. I'm joined today by Higher Education Licensing Pros, Chris Mall and Nan Kalki. We will begin with a half-hour webinar to begin with. We'll then have a 15-minute break, and then we'll have another hour webinar where we are, an hour-long webinar where we are really talking to practitioners. The first 30 minutes are really designed for educational leadership. Everyone who comes to this will have something they can learn, but and everyone is welcome to attend both parts. So I welcome you all here today. We're going to go ahead and get started. I will remind you that we are recording this. The recording will be available afterwards on the MHEC website. And if you have registered for these, you will receive an email follow-up with the recordings attached. Also, please use the Q&A section, not the chat, if you have questions, especially in the first part of the webinar. I'm probably not going to have too many chances or enough time to answer your questions verbally, but we always follow up these webinars with written responses to the questions that are in the chat. So never fear, we will make sure that we answer your questions. And of course, you can always reach out to any of us afterwards with additional questions or to seek some clarification. Please also take a few moments when you're done and complete the survey that we put out. We really want to know how we did on this webinar and how we can do better in the future. So once again, welcome. We are recording and we will get started. Well, I am going to turn it over to Chris Mall at Higher Ed Licensure Pros. These are our licensure rock stars, and we are deeply grateful for them. Welcome, Chris.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenny. I really appreciate MHEC hosting us again for another webinar on our favorite topic, right? Professional and occupational licensure. So if you haven't met me before, if I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you, my name is Chris Mall, and I'm half of the team here at Higher Education Licensure Pros. We founded HELP in response to the July 1, 2020 federal Title IV regulations related to licensure disclosures. And since that time, we've been working with colleges and universities across the US of all different types and sizes on compliance issues related to this. So I've got quite a bit of experience myself, focused exclusively on professional occupational licensure and higher education. A lot of that time I spent working for Capella University, which is a large online institution located in Minnesota. And that's where I had the pleasure of meeting Nan, the other co-founder of HELP. And so Nan's on the line today, but I'm going to be doing the presenting. So we are both glad that you're here and you're joining us today for this session. Here's the agenda. As Jenny mentioned, we have a two-part webinar today. So this first 30 minutes is going to be focused on an overview of what's required for this work, what some of the risks are and potential impacts to institutions, and really, again, with a lens of what leadership needs to know about those impacts and challenges to work through. We will take a short break then, 15 minutes, and then dig into part two, which is really focused on those of you who are in the weeds implementing this stuff at your institution. And so we have quite a few good topics that we'll be covering in that last hour. As Jenny also mentioned, if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A section as we go along today. We may not have time to get to any Q&As live during the first part, but we will certainly follow up with written responses, as Jenny said, after the webinar today. So please use that Q&A function with any of your questions. And the final thing I wanted to say before I dig in here to this part one is that what you're hearing from me today is not legal advice. There are a lot of risks around this work and, again, potential impacts that I'll be talking about. So please do seek out your own counsel to help make some of these decisions around how to approach this work and what is going to be best for your particular institution. All right, so let's dig in. what are we talking about today? What is this professional and occupational licensure work challenges, issues that are facing your institutions? As Jenny mentioned, we have some changes that are coming for this July 1st. And so what I'll be sharing now is includes those changes that are upcoming, that are effective this July 1st. And these requirements come under federal Title IV regulations. And so they're directly related to your institution's ability to participate in the federal financial aid program for your students to access those federal student loans and other funding. We also have SARA policy, State Authorization Reciprocity Agreement, that is applicable here. SARA policy basically reinforces the federal Title IV requirements and then extends that to non-Title IV participating institutions that are part of SARA. So that's kind of the framework for what we're talking about here. Under these Title IV regulations and SARA policy, institutions have three responsibilities when it comes to professional and occupational licensure. The first is you need to understand how your programs meet the educational requirements for licensure in US states and territories. I'm going to talk more in detail about each of these here in a moment. The second responsibility is that you need to certify that your programs do meet the educational requirements, where you are enrolling students in that licensure program and where you're advertising or recruiting for that licensure program. And then the third responsibility is around communication. This one is really an extension of the July 2020 regulations. And so institutions have a responsibility to communicate how your programs meet or do not meet those educational requirements for licensure in states and territories. So let's dig into this understanding piece a little bit more. Again, institutions have this responsibility to understand how your licensure programs meet educational requirements in each US state and territory where you are recruiting students or advertising for that licensure program, and most importantly, where you are enrolling students. So wanted to point out here right off the bat that this does apply to all modalities of programs. So whether you have a fully on-campus face-to-face licensure program or something that's almost or all fully online or distance education or some hybrid version, these requirements do apply to all types of programs across the board. Also wanted to point out here, licensure is really an umbrella term that can be called different things depending on the state or territory or the profession or occupation. So licensure is a state governed, state level regulated proposition here. So every state or territory gets to decide which professions and occupations they're going to regulate, how they're going to regulate them, the terminology that they're going to use, and the requirements that they're going to set. So sometimes you'll see this called a certification, certificate, endorsement, authorization. The list goes on and on. So just keep in mind that if you hear licensure, it's probably meant as a shorthand or an umbrella term for something else. And that's how I'll be using it today. So licensure could be called something else depending on the situation. What's a licensure program, right? So these regulations, the Title IV regulations and the SARA policy requirements relate to licensure programs. So what is that? We don't have a comprehensive list that is available from US Department of Ed or anyone else on exactly what a licensure program is. It ultimately is up to each institution to determine which of your programs are a licensure program. And there's two criteria that are used for this. The first is, what is the program designed to do? And the second is, what is it being advertised to do? So if you have programs that are purposefully designed to meet a professional or occupational license, or they're being marketed or advertised as leading to a profession or occupation that requires a license, or in particular to a license, then you're probably talking about a licensure program, and it would need to fall under these requirements. And how do you actually go about understanding licensure programs meet the educational requirements? Well, that takes a considerable amount of work. Specifically, you need to research each state and territory's requirements. for what it takes to earn a license. Again, because this is a state level regulated thing, we're talking about each state setting their requirements, determining which professions or occupations they're actually going to regulate and how. And so you do need to look at each state and territory's specific law and their licensing board and agency websites and other materials to determine what their educational requirements are for a license. All right, so once you have that understanding of how your licensure programs meet the educational requirements, you're going to have to apply that. And this responsibility, the certify responsibility, is the new responsibility Department of Ed has put into place for this July 1st. And it is the most impactful. It's really creating a heightened level of responsibility for institution when it comes to professional and occupational licensure. So let me share a little more about this new certify responsibility. This is related to the Program Participation Agreement, the PPA. The PPA is essentially the contract that every institution needs to sign with the U.S. Department of Education in order to participate in the Title IV Federal Financial Aid Program. So the PPA has been around for a long time. You have folks working in your financial aid team that I'm sure are very familiar with the PPA and different changes that have happened over time. What Department of Ed has done here is they've added a new section to the PPA that will require institutions starting this July 1st to certify that any of your licensure programs that you're offering, that they do in fact meet the educational requirements where the institution is located and where your students are located at the time of initial enrollment into the licensure program. Now, the good thing here is Department of Ed has created an exception where institutions could still potentially enroll a student who is located somewhere that the program doesn't meet educational requirements, but you have to have a written attestation process in place to do that. And I'm going to get way more into the weeds on things like written attestation in part 2 here, but just wanted to note that this is something important to keep in mind as you're working to implement these changes for July 1st. Creating a written attestation process and having that in place as part of probably your admissions process is going to be something important that gets set up for each institution. And I just want to be clear here. So that, the title of this webinar today is Continuing Enrollments in Licensure Programs After July 1st. The reason for that is because institutions cannot enroll students if they are located in a does not meet state or territory. So if you've done that research, someone at your institution's done the research and compared your programs, and you find that you do not meet the educational requirements, or if you haven't finished the research or haven't compared your program, so you don't know if you meet, you cannot enroll a student. The only exception is if they would go through a written attestation process and be able to document that they actually intend to seek licensure and employment in a state where your program does meet the educational requirements. So this could be impactful to enrollments from some programs at some institutions. It'd be wise to think about where your current students are coming from, those that they're currently enrolled, and again, where you anticipate attracting prospective students from to make sure you have a handle on what the potential impacts to enrollments could be for your institution. All right, I'm going to move now into the third responsibility that institutions have related to professional and occupational licensure. This is around communicating. As I mentioned before, this is not new. This is really continuing the responsibility that all institutions have under the July 1, 2020 version of these public and direct disclosure requirements. So U.S. Department of Education did make some small changes for the public disclosures. Starting this July 1st, institutions will need to have publicly disclosed, which is usually done on your website, those states and territories where you've determined that the program meets educational requirements and those locations where it does not meet the educational requirements. So if you're familiar with this at all, you may know that under the 2020 version of the regs, we have this third category or classification that we've not determined or no determination's been made yet. Many institutions are disclosing this third category on their public disclosures today, which again it is in compliance. That is, current effective regulation. Starting July 1 this year, that is no longer required that institutions disclose that third category of places where you haven't determined or no determination has been made about the program. So it's possible that you may want to update your public disclosures to remove those, not determined places if you still have those. But an institution could choose to continue disclosing them. So you may have scenarios where for some of your programs, you're not ready to make a determination, or because of where you're attracting students from, you may decide that you're not going to make a determination for a particular program. In that scenario, you could continue to disclose that publicly, but you're no longer obligated to after this July 1st. All right, so just a note here, kind of connecting these three responsibilities together. For public disclosures, you really should be disclosing states and territories as meets. So you should have that understanding after you've done the research and made the comparison. You should be disclosing them as meets if you have students located there from that state or territory, or if you're advertising or recruiting for that particular licensure program. So I'm just pointing this out to say, as I was mentioning, right, you could have a list of meets and does not meet, and maybe some states and territories that are not determined. But if you're actively advertising or recruiting for that licensure program, and certainly if you're enrolling students that are located in that state or territory, you would need to be disclosing that you meet the educational requirements there. All right, so I'm going to move to the individual direct disclosures. Again, this is not new, and actually the US Department of Education did not change anything with this particular subsection of the regulation for 2024. So we have the exact same language that exists under the 2020 version related to individual direct disclosures. These are going to be tied to the prospective student or student's location, which is set by your institution's individual student location policy. So Department of Education has not dictated how an institution must determine your student or prospective student's location. Rather, you must have a policy in place and a process for doing that. And so your student location policy, if it's determining that a prospective student's located in one of these does not meet locations or some state or territory where you haven't determined yet, you would need to send them a direct disclosure prior to initial enrollment in that licensure program. And initial enrollment also has not been defined clearly by Department of Ed for these. And so there is a little flexibility for when an institution considers that point of time of initial enrollment. Note that it does need to be prior to financial commitment to the institution. So these direct disclosures need to go out to prospective students before they make that financial commitment to your institution and enroll in that licensure program. And these are typically done through email. It can be any written format to the student. It is something that would need to be retained in the student's record and documented so that it could be made available to the Department of Ed or some other audits in the future if needed. All right, in addition to prospective students, we also have a requirement around current students for direct disclosures. If something changes and that student is located now and it does not meet state or territory, maybe the student themselves moved and changed locations and made the institution aware. Maybe something changed with the state or territory's licensure requirements. And so now your program no longer meets those requirements. There's been a change in classes required or hours or something like that. Or even if you update your program's curriculum in such a way that it no longer is satisfying that particular state's educational requirements, you would need to notify all current students within 14 calendar days of the institution becoming aware of the change. And again, all of this direct disclosure responsibility has been in place since July 1st of 2020. We know working with institutions, though, over the past few years, that many don't have a full direct disclosure process quite implemented yet. So if your institution's in that boat where you're not sure if you're sending all of these direct disclosures to the required audiences, I would recommend that you put this towards the top of your list to get sorted through and implemented before July 1st. All right, so I'm going to share some additional information now. The Department of Education released earlier this month. This came through an electronic announcement from Ed. Essentially, what they're doing is creating a small window of opportunity for certain institutions with very particular, unique circumstances to document what those circumstances are and then potentially use that as a defense to an enforcement action by the department in the future, should that occur. So maybe I'll clarify what it's not first and then talk a little bit more about what it is. This is not delaying the effective date of these regulations. So everything is still effective July 1st of 2024. And this is particularly targeted at the new PPA certification section. So that certify responsibility, it is not related to the communicating responsibility. It's not related to public or individual direct disclosures. So those are important things to keep in mind. But what this electronic announcement is doing, Department of Ed is indicated, again, if you are in some sort of unique situation where there are circumstances outside of the institution's control, they're unique and time specific, it's going to prevent you from being in full compliance with that new certified responsibility on July 1. You should document those things, and then that could be used as a defense if the department would bring an enforcement action against the institution between July 1 and January 1, 2025. If you think your institution may be in this type of situation, this is something you would definitely want to seek counsel on and then come up with your processes for how you're going to document what these circumstances are. All right, I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the risks and potential impacts here with these particular requirements and responsibilities. So as I've said several times, right, this is a Title IV regulation from Department of Education, which means that any and all non-compliance measures that would be possible if an institution's not complying with Title IV requirements could come to fruition here. So ultimately, what we would be talking about is losing that eligibility for an institution to participate in Title IV. That would be the ultimate impact here for an institution if you're not in compliance with these regulations. Some other things to think about related to Title IV, but outside of these particular regulations that we're talking about here, you could have claims around misrepresentation or borrow defense to repayment. I know both of those have seen an uptick in claims or cases being brought forward by graduates or students in the near or the recent past. And it's possible that those could be related to, determination or a statement that you're making about licensure. So keep those in mind as possible areas of risk here. Something else that we've also been hearing about are accreditors, whether that's a regional accreditor or a specialized or programmatic accreditor. Also, the state authorization reciprocity agreement, SARA portal entities, and state higher ed regulators have been inquiring about these licensure compliance issues. So asking to specifically see the direct disclosures that institutions are sending to those prospective students and students, or wanting to see the public disclosures, and how institutions are deciding which states they meet and which ones they don't meet. So there are entities outside of the Department of Education itself that could be asking your institution to produce, your compliance efforts and demonstrate compliance around these. So just wanted to keep that in mind too. There are some unique challenges to implementing this work, and I'm highlighting a couple here. We're going to get more into these in part 2 as well. But one of the biggest challenges is that this responsibility to understand if your programs meet educational requirements or not does sit squarely on each institution. So there are very few opportunities for institutions to submit their licensure programs to out-of-state licensing boards or agencies for review. That means that it is up to the institution to make that determination if your program meets or doesn't meet the educational requirements. You're most likely not going to be able to seek that external validation from a licensing board or agency. So that's a challenge, and it also creates some risk, right? Another challenge is to do that work is very time consuming. I have some numbers here on the next slide, just briefly run through. This time consideration is based on Higher Education Licensure Pros experience over the past several years. We're doing this work as well as my own experience working for an institution for a number of years. So there's a big range here because the amount of time it takes just depends on the license type. Some are way more complicated than others to do that research and understand what those requirements are. It also takes a certain level of expertise to do this work, right? So as I mentioned, we're talking about state law. It's looking at the statutes, regulations, administrative rules, reviewing board meeting minutes sometimes, again, contacting state licensing boards sometimes to get clarification. So this isn't work that can just be assigned to anyone at an institution. It does take a certain level of expertise or experience to do this. Because of the time and expertise, it can be very costly to do this work. And so the cost estimates here on this slide were presented by a group of institutions from Mississippi at a national conference back in 2022. They calculated their costs based on that internal staff and faculty time that they were devoting to this research work and program comparison. So who exactly needs to be involved in doing this work at institutions? It's of course going to look different for different institutions, right? But really we see some common roles that are engaged in this work in order to make it successful. So if you have someone who is in some sort of compliance director role, this could be sitting in, a provost or academic affairs office. It could be someone who's maybe even in your distance education office. Oftentimes there's a lot of overlap there. It could be the same person who's responsible for state authorization reciprocity agreement work. So a lot of different hats are often worn by this person. Accreditation is another one that we commonly see, someone who's in the accreditation team being assigned this kind of compliance role, if you will, for this. So having somebody who's kind of on point, who is, the person who is responsible for making sure that all of these things are moving forward is a good idea to have a point person in place, whether that's the compliance director or someone else. And then there are key offices and teams that need to be engaged in this because it does really cut across the institution. So you're thinking about each licensure program, most institutions have more than just a handful, right? So you're talking about teachers, nurses, if you have any kind of health sciences offerings, that can be quite lengthy. Mental health counseling, other mental health professions. I'm going to stop naming them because it's a very long list, but you get the idea, right? So your institution likely has multiple and maybe dozens or more different licensure programs. So you have all of those program directors and leaders. You have the faculty and curriculum experts within each of those programs. They're the ones that are going to need to really dig in and do that comparison to the state requirements. Obviously, your admissions team or enrollment team will be critical, in particular with the new certify responsibility, right? Institutions cannot enroll a prospective student or applicant unless they're located in a MEET state or territory. So there's going to need to be some kind of process for those teams, as well as probably something within your system itself. And that's why you need to have IT involved in this work as well. And then financial aid, as I mentioned, this new certified responsibility is through the program participation agreement. So certainly financial aid needs to be aware that this is out there, but also most importantly, know what these compliance efforts are. So when it comes time for them to sign that PPA certification for your institution, all of your ducks will be in a row. Some institutions are also using external support. As I mentioned, we've been working with colleges and universities around the country for the past few years, all different types. So if you're interested in working with us, you'll have access to these slides. I'm not going to say any more about that, but we do have many ways that we work with institutions to help them come in compliance. And I think we have approximately a minute and a half. So I'm going to put Jenny on the spot. If there was a question that came in the Q&A that you think would be great to answer live, I'm happy to do that before we go into our break.
All right. Thank you, Chris. We do have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to go with the first one. So if we are not actively going to, say, Texas and recruiting or advertising for nursing, but we have a student who enrolls in our Michigan-based nursing program, do we have to worry about the curricular compliance issue because they may have seen an ad or something on Facebook, YouTube, or elsewhere?
Yeah, these are great questions to be thinking about. Unfortunately, we don't have specifics from Department of Education on these limitations around advertising or recruiting. Department of Ed should be publishing a Q&A guidance document on this topic area soon. And I'm hopeful that there will be some additional details in there on kind of what the scope of that is.
Great. Thank you. Do we have time for one more or not?
Let's do it. Yeah.
All right, let's do it. Okay. We are only required to offer a written attestation to students for do not meet or don't know state, from do not meet or do not know states, not all students, correct?
That is correct. Under the Title IV regulation, the written attestations only if they're located somewhere where your program does not meet or you've not made a determination yet.
All right. Well, there we go. Let's take a break.
Right.
And we will be back. Thank you all for joining us. We will. Welcome.
That was not expected. Sorry, Jenny.
That's all right. I am welcoming you all back to our webinar. Thank you for joining us either for the first time or rejoining us after you attended our earlier webinar. I will get to it very quickly here. Just some reminders. We are recording this, and that recording will be available to you afterwards. You'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording, but you can always find it via the links in the past events pages on the MEC website that will lead you right to our YouTube channel. All of the resources will be available as well. Please use the Q&A section, not the chat section, to ask questions. It's in that Q&A section that we will read from questions at the end of the webinar and try to get you some verbal answers, but that's where we'll also go so that Chris and Nan can do some follow-up with written answers to any of the questions you have. So please remember to put your questions there. And then finally, please take a few moments after the survey after the webinar to complete our survey so that we know how we did today and how we can do better in the future. So I am going to move us forward here. We are talking about professional licensure and all of the new things that you need to do and know that are coming up due on July 1st. I'm going to turn it over now to Chris.
Great. Thanks so much, Jenny. And if you weren't able to join us for the first 30 minutes, you can see what we did for part one of the agenda. I did an overview of the requirements and some of the challenges, risks, and impacts institutions. And now for part two, we're really going to get into the weeds here together, talk about some of the particular challenges with implementing these new requirements and considerations for institutions as you're working through this. So I've got some topics here highlighted on the agenda that we're going to be touching on. And then we do hope to have time for questions at the end of the presentation. So as Jenny mentioned, please put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat so that we can have those in one place and we'll hopefully get to them. As a reminder, if you were here for part one or new information, if you're just joining us, this is not legal advice that I'm providing today. A lot of these topics that we'll be covering do benefit from legal counsel. So I would encourage institutions to seek that out as you're working through implementing these new requirements. All right, so we're going to do things maybe a little bit differently today. If you've seen other MEC webinars that we've presented, rather than me just presenting the whole time, we have some poll questions that we're providing. So this is the first one. We're kicking it off with a poll. We're going to talk about licensure programs. So if you could please either scan the QR code on this slide from your mobile device and use that to complete the poll, or you can go to slido.com on your computer and put in number 2743625. At the top of the Slido website, there's a little search bar. And if you put in that number 2743625, it will take you to the poll as well. And in just about 30 seconds here, I'm going to present the poll so we'll all be able to see in real time as these results are coming in. But if you could take a moment to answer this poll question, that'll get us started for part 2 here today. All right, so I see some answers already coming in. Thank you. You can still participate. Again, you can scan the QR code here or go to slido.com, put in 2743625. So we've got a lot of different responses coming in. This is one where you can select more than one answer for this question. So far, we've got all of the above as leading the pack. I guess our results could be skewed, right? You could select all of them and all of the above. That would be an option to select here. But you'll see as these are changing throughout, right? We've got different opinions or thoughts on if any or all of these are licensure programs. So while these are continuing to come in, I will point out a few things that maybe you didn't think about. Maybe you're not familiar with some of these types of programs if your institution doesn't offer them. Bachelor of Science in Nursing, for example. So sometimes those programs are designed to lead to a registered nurse license, but sometimes they're designed for someone who already holds an RN license, but doesn't yet have a bachelor's degree. So there are different types of those BSN programs that exist. If that was designed to lead to an RN license, so if it was, for people who are not yet a registered nurse, then it certainly would be a licensure program. But the ones that are not designed for that, somebody already has to have an RN license to be admitted, and that probably would not be a licensure program. So that's an example there. We've got some others that can be a little bit complicated. I'm not going to go through all of them. Happy to answer particular questions if people have them. But yeah, there are multiple correct answers. So all of the above could be a licensure program. Here are some things for you to keep in mind as you are evaluating your programs at your institution, trying to sort out which ones are licensure programs or not. So if you were here for part 1, you already heard me say this, right? But licensure is really an umbrella term. And so it could be called something else, certification, endorsement, authorization, registration, depending on the state or territory and depending on the license the thing that's being issued, depending on the profession or occupation. That's what I was going for. So we have different terminology here, and licensure is used kind of as that umbrella or catch-all term. A key consideration is there's something, whatever it's required, issued by a state or territory government entity, such as a licensing board or agency, that is required for employment. If those answers are yes, then certainly it's a license, and that would be a licensure program if it's preparing someone for that. So we don't have a specific definition or a specific comprehensive list of licensure programs from the Title IV regulations themselves or from Department of Education. So ultimately, different institutions may come to different conclusions, even for similar program types here. The criteria to keep in mind are what is the program designed for and what is it being advertised for, right? So when you're thinking about what's it designed to do, really considering what are those particular curriculum or professional standards that have been used to develop the program initially or revise the program. An important consideration here would include programmatic or specialized accreditors, right? So if you have particular standards that the program is being developed around to achieve a specialized accreditation, is there some assumptions that that accreditation is being achieved to help prepare for licensure? There are definitely connections there with specialized and programmatic accreditation and licensure. Another thing to think about is if you've designed the program to prepare students for a licensing exam. In particular, I think it's important to note if that program is then reporting licensing exam results and data to anyone, again, maybe to a specialized accreditor or for some other purpose. So if you're really trying to prepare students to pass a licensure exam, that may be a factor that weighs a program onto that licensure program list. Or if there's just an expectation that graduates would ultimately seek a license, at least most of them, certainly a factor to consider. And then for advertising, yes, it is important to look at the language that's being used in your program descriptions, on the catalog, on your websites, on other people's websites that are marketing your program, like a third-party aggregator site, or if you work with an online program manager, how are they talking about the program? What descriptions are they using? If there are any references in those statements around preparing for a license or maybe even a licensing exam, that's something you'll want to weigh. Also, keep in mind, a lot of websites list, here are the possible career opportunities, or here are the types of jobs that you can qualify for after you earn this this program or certificate. If those are listing things that are professions and occupations that require a license, you should be really cautious about that, right? So if it's not going to be a licensure program, you probably shouldn't be listing a particular profession or occupation as an outcome that does require a license. So other factors to consider there with the advertising. All right, I'm going to move on to research and curriculum comparisons. So this slide, we just put a common question that we get around this work and then our answer. So, oftentimes people ask, how do I know when we need to do one of those detailed in-depth curriculum comparisons, looking at our program's classes or supervised experience like practicum and internship or student teaching, and compare that to a state's requirements? And do I need to do that often, or is that something we can just do one time? Well, the answer is really, you're only going to know if a curriculum comparison is needed after you do the research to understand what the state or territory's licensing requirements are themselves. So when you dig into that research, it usually becomes clear pretty quickly if you'll need to do one of these curriculum comparisons for that program against that state's requirements. Sometimes these are going to be, again, very detailed, where you're looking at individual classes, even down to the assignment level for some of these license types, and matching up your curriculum to that unique state's requirements. Other times it's at a higher level, and as I mentioned before, specialized accreditation can be a factor. So you may be just ensuring that your program has that specialized accreditation or programmatic accreditation that the state is looking for. And unfortunately, this will not be a one-time effort, right? I think like most compliance things, there are ongoing processes and maintenance that will be required. That will be true for these curriculum comparisons as well, because something could change about a state's requirements. So what their actual educational or curricular requirements are. Something could change with the program. Programs get updated for all sorts of reasons. Maybe there's new specialized accreditation standards that the program needs to meet, some other external standards that it's being updated towards, or you just want to change the program and revise some of the classes. All of those things could impact this curriculum comparison and the ultimate determination if the program meets or not. So keep that in mind. Some other things to consider when you're doing this research work in the curriculum comparison. Probably most of you on the line, especially if you've been doing this, know that it takes a tremendous amount of time and effort to engage in this work. So finding what those education requirements are in other states and territories involves legal research, where you're looking at state statutes, regulations, and rules, licensing board and agency websites, application forms, maybe board meeting minutes, really digging in to the details there to understand what the requirements are. And then you have to compare your program to it. So if you were here for part one, you heard me say one of the challenges is there really are not opportunities for institutions to submit their programs to out-of-state licensing boards or agencies for review. Those processes, unfortunately, just don't exist for most professions and occupations for most states. So it is up to you as the institution to look at your curriculum in detail and then compare that with each state and territory's requirements and make that determination if you think your curriculum meets or doesn't meet those requirements. A couple other notes on the specialized accreditation. So sometimes we hear from people assumptions that, well, the program has specialized accreditation. Our graduates can qualify to sit for a licensing exam. And so doesn't our program meet everywhere? What else do we need to look at? Well, there can be additional requirements. So even professions or occupations that are aligned behind one standard national licensing exam, or that are aligned behind one or two maybe programmatic accreditors, there are states that still have their own unique requirements that they place on top of that. So it's important to take a look here. Just an example of some of these, specialized accreditation plus extra things. We see this in social work, where for clinical license types as a social worker, there are specific classes that a state board will be looking at your graduate's transcript, and those classes have to be on the transcript or they will not qualify for a clinical social work license. Similar for counseling. So even if your program has CACREP accreditation, which is a specialized accreditor for counseling programs, that may not be enough in states that have very specific coursework or practicum and internship requirements. The board will look at your graduate's transcripts and have to see those classes there. So it's important that institutions look at those details and compare them before you would make a meets determination and then disclose that to prospective students and students. Something else to keep in mind is we don't have a set time frame. So I mentioned just a moment ago, right, that this is work that will need to be maintained and updated. It's not a one and done kind of thing. We don't have a particular time frame that Department of Ed has dictated here. So it is up to each institution, again, to set your own kind of cadence and calendar for when you're going to be reviewing this and making any updates that are needed. So that's a consideration. Maybe align it with some of your other processes. We like to suggest an annual process just because that does align with some of the other reporting requirements from U.S. Department of Education and others. So that's a consideration as well. And then finally, I wanted to touch on documentation. So in particular with this research work and curriculum comparisons, I think documentation is really critical and something maybe that has not been looked at too closely at some institutions yet. So, what kind of documentation are your subject matter experts like faculty or program director putting together to demonstrate how they're deciding if a program meets educational requirements in a state or not? And then where is that documentation going to live, right? Probably shouldn't just be with that program director somewhere on their, personal drive. It should be something accessible to whoever would need to produce it in the future if an audit was required and Department of Ed or someone else asks, how was this determination made, or show us how you decided that the program meets educational requirements in this state. So really important to think through that documentation process. Who's doing the documentation, when and how, and where it's being stored, who has access to that. Okay, another Q&A here, and then I have a poll coming up again, another poll here in a moment. But something that's come up quite a bit with questions that we've been getting around licensure compacts and interstate reciprocity agreement. So some of you, I'm sure, have heard this in the July 1, 2024 final regulations that were released. Department of Education provided some commentary around that related to compacts and reciprocity agreements. And we're talking about licensure reciprocity agreements. I'm not talking about the state authorization reciprocity agreement, SARA. That's totally separate, and SARA has nothing really to do with licensure, the ability for someone to be licensed in an occupation or profession. So with licensing reciprocity agreements and licensure compacts, Department of Ed gave an example in their commentary where they're saying, basically, look, we understand that there are different pathways or mechanisms for graduates of programs to achieve a license in other states. And the example they gave is specific to teacher licensing. They were talking about someone who completes a teacher preparation program in one state and then seeks a license in another state. And if both of those states are participating in it's called the NASDAQ Interstate Reciprocity Agreement for Educators, and then it's possible that that is the mechanism the person would use when they're applying for the license in the new state or other state. Department of Ed, again, recognizes this as a valid piece of information for institutions to use when they're making meets or does not meet determinations about programs. So the shorthand here is yes. I think moving forward, licensure compacts and interstate reciprocity agreements are a consideration that institutions should keep in mind as you're doing that research and program comparison and ultimately making decisions if your programs meet or don't meet. There are some considerations though. So I do like to say this is one area where I really feel institutions should proceed with some caution. So this is new. The department hasn't mentioned compact and reciprocity agreements, under prior versions of regulations related to this. It's something that they've just included in the commentary with these July 1, 2024 changes. So obviously this hasn't been tested, right? We don't really know exactly the extent to what the department will allow or what they think about this. Based on some things that I know about licensing compacts and reciprocity agreements, it does make me wonder a little bit on if the department's concerned about someone qualifying for a license in another state, or if they're okay with someone just having the ability to practice across state lines. And then there are other considerations too, some I've got here on the screen. So, thinking really about what does that particular licensing compact do? Is it covering somebody who's a brand new graduate from a program, or would they need to have experience? Certainly if somebody needs work experience, then you wouldn't want to factor that into a meets determination in your work that you're doing. Is it something where they'll actually be issued a license, like I was saying, or is it just granting them the ability to practice in other states without needing to earn that other state's license? And are there any additional requirements, things that your graduates would need to do if they're applying through this mechanism of relying on a compact or reciprocity agreement? So all important considerations as you're looking at how these compacts or reciprocity agreements can maybe help assist you in determining that your programs meet educational requirements. All right, so as I mentioned, I have another poll here. If you'd be so kind as to scan the QR code on the slide you see, or go to slido.com 4189360. This one's about student location policy. So I have a student location scenario up for the poll. You want to read that and then submit your response with where you think that particular student would be located. And in just a moment, I'll present the link here so you all can see as those answers are coming in. All right. So here's the poll. We're talking about a prospective student for a law program. The student actually currently lives in Iowa City, Iowa, because they're enrolled in an undergraduate program at the University of Iowa. They'll be graduating soon. Their permanent address is Overland Park, Kansas. That's where their family's at, where they left to go to University of Iowa. And they're applying for that JD program at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. So where should University of Missouri, Kansas City treat the student as located? And we've got some answers coming in here. So we've got a smaller number saying Missouri. We've got some for Iowa, some for Kansas, and then quite a few of you are responding with it depends on the institution's student location policy. Just give 2 more seconds here if any more responses come in. Yeah, so this one actually as well, there are really multiple correct answers because it ultimately does depend on the institution's student location policy. So, student location policy has been something that's been important for professional and occupational licensure compliance since 2020 when the disclosure regulations were put into place, right? Those individual direct disclosures are connected to student location policy. So, whatever your policy says, where a prospective student or student is located, if there's somewhere that does not meet or not determined, then you would need to send out the direct disclosure. That continues to be true after this July 1st. So that is not changing. But student location policy is even more important now under the changes for July 1, and that's because of the new certify responsibility, right? So every institution has to be able to certify through the program participation agreement that your programs meet the educational requirements where your students are located and where the institution is located. That's shorthand, so we can get into details more if people have questions. But basically, Department of Ed has not prescribed what the student location policy needs to be or what your processes need to be around that. Rather, it does indicate that you need to have a student location policy in place. That policy should be reviewed and updated regularly, just like any other institutional policy would be. You need to apply it consistently at the institution, and you have to make that student location policy available to Department of Ed if they ever ask you for it. So, what are some things to think about as you're crafting or updating your student location policies? Here are some considerations that we've been hearing and working through with institutions we're working with. Really, it's important to think about scenarios where you're going to have students relocating to your campus to complete a program. So, kind of like the poll scenario I gave, you have a student living in Iowa at the moment, but they're going to be relocating to your campus at University of Missouri, Kansas City, to complete that. So, where would you consider them? They're currently located in Iowa, but they're going to be relocating to the campus to do that JD program when classes start. You can define all of those things in the student location policy itself, like how you're going to be treating those scenarios. Also, you can have differences for graduate versus undergraduate students, and we know some institutions are doing this, again, just because of the nature of their student body and the programs that they're offering. So you can set up some distinctions there. The applied consistently at the institution point is that, overarching, you're applying whatever the policy is consistently. But again, you can have some distinctions made here for different populations or subgroups of your students. So you may have students commuting across state borders to do one of your face-to-face programs or a hybrid program, right? How are you going to treat those students who may have a physical address in the border state, but they're commuting to your campus for all or at least some of those in-person courses that are required for the program? Also, international students. These regulations, again, are Title IV regulations, but they apply at the program level, not per individual student. So even if you have, international students who would not be accessing Title IV, if you're enrolling them in a Title IV program, you will need to consider how you're treating them as far as location. And if they are located in a U.S. state or territory per your location policy, making sure that you can do the PPA certification and send any disclosures that might be needed. And finally, don't want to forget military affiliated students. Unfortunately, this one is a particular challenge. Department of Ed has not really made any concessions or exceptions that account for the unique situation that most military affiliated students find themselves in, right? Oftentimes they don't know where they're going to be in the next few years or beyond as far as their physical location. So if you have distance or online programs that you're enrolling military students in, it could be a challenge, again, depending on the scenario, and there's no special consideration for them with that written attestation process. They have to select one particular meet state that they indicate they're going to seek licensure and employment in through the written attestation in order for you to enroll them if they're located somewhere that does not meet. speaking of written attestations, here's a question that we get about this. So people often wonder, exactly what does that need to look like, the written attestation? Can we have some sort of automated form that we integrate into our application itself? And the student or applicant just selects where they're going to be seeking a license. That may work for at least a portion of this responsibility under written attestation. So the Department of Education has said in the commentary that they released with these final regulations that they're really interested in seeing a process around written attestation. So it's not simply about a form or a written statement itself. Department of Ed is concerned with the process that the institution is using around this. And so they want to make sure that those students really truly understand that they're not going to be eligible for a license and that does not meet state or the state where you've not determined. And the student has to have some interaction with someone at the institution around that. And then the documentation piece is also important. So the actual form or written statement itself is important and needs to include some certain information that I'll pull up here in a moment. But again, maybe an automated form integrated into your admission application itself could be a useful part of this process, but it's not going to be the be all end all. So I know this slide I have quite a bit. I do want to give credit to Cheryl Dowd, who is the director at the State Authorization Network. If you're not familiar, they do great work in this area as well as many other areas. So these are things to keep in mind, considerations when you're thinking about your written attestation process for your institution, right? So we do have these two components. We have the process and the documentation. We don't have a specific template or form from the department on what the documentation needs to be. We just kind of have these rough guidelines. So again, the process, it has to have some sort of interaction with that applicant or prospective student and someone at the institution where they're getting an understanding that they're located somewhere where the program doesn't meet, and that prospective student is making their intent known that, well, I actually want to seek a license and employment in a different state. Okay, great. So if that different state is one where the program does meet the educational requirements, then that could be a scenario where this written attestation exception comes into play. So again, this is an exception to that enrollment restriction for students located in does not meet or not determined states. So once that process, that interaction happens, then you need to think about that documentation itself. So again, it could be some sort of more automated form, but the student would still have to, themselves be selecting the state. It wouldn't be up to the institution to tell them which state to select. And obviously the student would need to sign that, and it would need to become part of their official record and then made available to the Department of Ed should they ever ask in the future. All right, I have another poll question here for the group. We're going to shift gears into disclosures. So if you'd be so kind to scan the QR code or go to slido.com, 1174620 is the number this time. And in just a moment, I'll go ahead and present the link so we can all see what the responses are coming through. So this poll question has a scenario on if a direct disclosure is required for a particular prospective student or applicant. All right, and I apologize for the abbreviations, but there are character limits in how many characters I could put in the question. So this prospective student lives in Guam. They're applying for a Master of Science in Behavior Analysis program in Minnesota. They actually plan to live with some family in Wisconsin for the time that they're enrolled in the program. And this particular institution has not made a licensure determination about this program, the MS in Applied Behavior Analysis, because Minnesota doesn't issue a license for a behavior analyst. So they haven't yet made any determinations for licensure. So what do they do? And is a direct disclosure required? And if so, maybe, for what state or territory would this prospective student need to get a disclosure? We've got answers coming in here. Most of you are saying it depends on the institution's student location policy. We've got some no's, that no direct disclosure is required. Some of you are indicating it depends if it's a distance education program. And then a couple choosing yes for Wisconsin or yes for Guam. So like all of my poll questions, there are potentially multiple correct answers to this one. But I agree with the majority of you. It really is going to depend on that institution's student location policy, right? How they're treating a prospective student who's located in Guam at the moment, but planning to live in Wisconsin and do their Minnesota-based program. I also think it depends on if it's a distance ed program or not, right? So will that student be commuting from Wisconsin to Minnesota in order to do the program, or are they going to be living with their family in Wisconsin and doing their courses online, right? So that's another consideration as well. And I don't think necessarily the yeses are incorrect either, because it ultimately is going to depend on the institution's student location policy and where that prospective student is located. So some other things to keep in mind, considerations for disclosures. And again, if you missed part one, just a real quick recap, really there haven't been many substantial changes for disclosures from the current 2020 version. So we still have public disclosures required and individual direct disclosures. The one change here is for public disclosures, Department of Ed is basically removed that third category, the not determined or no determination made. Those no longer have to be disclosed on your public disclosures starting July 1st of this year. They can be disclosed if an institution wants to. There's nothing in the regulation that prevents you from disclosing that information, but the department has removed that as an obligation for institutions starting July 1. So you do have to disclose those states and territories where you've made a determination that the program meets and where it does not meet the educational requirements. A couple of key things to keep in mind here. So we have information coming from Department of Education staff that institutions should only be advertising programs and recruiting students from meets, states, and territories. So if you have, states or territories listed as does not meet, or you don't have them listed at all because they're not determined, then you shouldn't be advertising or recruiting. And I know we'll get questions on what does that mean. I don't know yet. I don't think anyone knows yet for sure. The department hasn't put forth specifics around what they mean by advertising or recruiting. It does seem like the focus is on for that particular licensure program rather than broadly advertising your institution or even a college within the institution or something like that. It's about those concerted efforts related to that particular licensure program where you haven't made a meets determination. And then another thing to consider, this is pretty new information that I received from an institution we're working with that had contacted Department of Education with questions. So Department of Ed staff is saying, you can list states and territories as meets if they don't offer or they don't require a license for that profession or occupation, as long as you also make that note as part of the disclosure. So I know this has been a question that's come up in the past. What do we do with these states or territories that don't issue a license? There's nothing available there for our graduates. So what do we disclose? Do we disclose meets or does not meet or nothing? So the department, again, very recently through an email has said you can list them as meets as long as you're clear that you have a note to the effect that there's no license issued or required in that state or territory. Okay, then for direct disclosures, this is the one where nothing has changed from 2020. So we have the exact same requirements. You'll need to send direct disclosures to prospective students prior to initial enrollment in the licensure program if they're located and it does not meet or are not determined. And then we do still have that current student disclosure requirement, 14 calendar days if something changes and a current student is now in a does not meet scenario. All right. So I left plenty of time for questions, and I see there are quite a few questions, it looks like, in the Q&A. So I'll ask Jenny if she can help field some of these.
Oh, you bet. There are a lot of questions. So I'm just going to go back and get into some of them. All right. First, we are only required to offer a written attestation to students from do not meet and don't know states, not all states, correct?
That is correct. The written attestation is only for the does not meet locations or where you've not determined.
Great. If other states require licensure in a program, but our program isn't advertised or set up to obtain licensure, do we research other states to see if our program meets their requirements for licensure, just in case a student will return to a particular state?
Mm. Yeah, so I think different institutions are going to approach this one a little differently. Again, just depending on your particular student population, where they're coming from, or where they're located, and your programs you're offering. So I say always go back to those two criteria. What's it designed to do, and what is it being advertised to do? And if you recall in the advertising piece, some considerations you may want to keep in mind. It's not just, a specific statement of our program is designed for this license. There could be other factors as well. What are you describing as a career outcome? Is it listing a specific occupation or job that would require a license in those other states? And if again, combined with where you're attracting students from or where your students are located, it may make sense for your program to figure out, what's going on in other states. But I know some institutions are kind of taking the other approach, right? If you don't have a license in your state, so that example I gave for applied behavioral analysis, there's no license related to that in Minnesota. And so that Minnesota institution had not made a determination about their program. So if it's not designed to prepare students for a license in the state where your institution is, or in any state, and you're not, enrolling students from out of state, then you may not make any determinations. It's going to be up to each institution, I think, to figure out how to approach that scenario.
Great, thank you. All right, can you define what you mean when you say financial commitment? Does that include acceptance fees and seat deposits?
Yes, also good question that I don't know has a clear answer. So the financial commitment idea comes from the commentary that the Department of Education released with the 2020 version of the regulations. And so again, the thought was, before a student has made, they don't use the word substantial, but I'm inserting that, a substantial financial commitment to your institution to engage in that program, you need to let them know what's going on. The whole idea of these regulations are to protect students, right? So the department's trying to avoid scenarios where a student is really far down a path with a particular program or institution, but it's not going to meet their ultimate career or employment needs. So I think you have to use that lens when you're thinking about, okay, what point in time exactly are we going to set as that initial enrollment date, which would trigger those direct disclosures to go out and would trigger that responsibility for PPA certification. There may be some minimal fees that a student would incur as part of an application process that might not rise to that level of financial commitment. But again, it's going to depend on your institution, I think, and what your processes are.
Great, thank you. Could schools use a checkbox disclosure within their online application to meet the requirement? The acknowledgement would be retained within our system.
So I'm assuming this one's related to the written attestation. If it's not, whoever asked the question, please put a revised question in the Q&A here. But so kind of along the lines of the poll or the sample that I gave, right? So for a written attestation, can we just automate something as part of our admission application and have that be sufficient? Unfortunately, I think the answer is no. The department is really clear that they don't want this written attestation exception to just be like a check the box scenario where students are kind of blindly checking things just to get their application processed and admitted. They do want it to be an opportunity for that particular prospective student to really understand what the limitations are of that program when it relates to earning a license in the place where they're located. So that automated piece could be a component, but definitely institutions will need to have more that you're doing to help educate that student or inform them before you get to the point of some sort of automated form or effort within your application itself.
Okay. For the public disclosure website, we may continue to indicate licensure certification has not been determined. Yes? Any additional comments about continuing to disclose when determinations have not been made?
Right. So under public disclosure starting this July 1st, institutions are no longer obligated to disclose the states and territories where you've not determined, but you could still do so if you choose. I think some institutions we've heard from are deciding to continue to disclose those just so that they have a more full set of information available on their website, right? Sometimes it might look weird if a prospective student's looking at your webpage and it says meets for these 2 states, does not meet for 3 states, and then everything else is missing,
Right.
It could raise questions. They may not know what's going on. So you may want to include it just to have more fulsome information out there.
Got it. Thank you. Are engineering programs considered licensure programs? While they might and can lead to licensure as a professional engineer, it is not required to work in the discipline. Is that, in that case, does it depend on how we market our programs?
I would say yes. It definitely depends on how you're marketing or advertising those programs. And also don't forget the designing piece, right? To talk to the program itself. So the program leadership, how did they consider that program to be designed, right? Is there expectation that students are going to go on to earn a professional engineer license? Do they require that the professional engineer licensing exam be completed? Are they reporting those exam scores anywhere? So those are other things in addition to the marketing and advertising. And I feel like I've already talked about that a few times, but it's not just this leads to a professional engineer license, right? You have to consider the other things as well, how you're describing it, what kinds of work opportunities or experiences it could lead to.
Thank you. If a student is in a licensure program and decides to pick up an online course, not change to a completely online program, how does that play into these new regulations?
Right. I think this question is maybe getting at the distance education definition that the US Department of Education has provided that should be applied to these regulations. So for those of you who have heard me talk about this in the past, you probably will remember how I approach this, right? So when I've been talking about this, I've just been saying generally students, not distance education students. In the regulation language itself for this new PPA certification section, it does indicate distance education students. However, the definition Department of Education is using is any student who's going to take one or more online class during that first term of enrollment, or could take an online class during the first term of enrollment, should be considered distance education. So I'm kind of been removing that from the equation because ultimately, if you meet these requirements for all your students, obviously you're going to satisfy it for any distance education. I'm using air quotes because, again, department's applying that unique definition here, meet those requirements. So this question, right, if you have a student who is enrolled in a licensure program and then they decide to take one class online during their first term, well, you already would have met the requirements for all students. So I don't think there would be a substantive change there. Recall, everything's going to come back to your student location policy and how you're treating students. So if that student's physically located on your campus because they're doing a primarily, campus-based, face-to-face program, and they just happen to be taking one class online, but they're taking it from their dorm room, like they're still located on your campus. That distance education piece really doesn't factor in. So that's why I don't talk about that as much specifically. If you set up your processes and implement these with a focus on all your students, I think you're going to cover your bases for any special considerations around distance education.
Got it. Thank you. What about programs that lead to federal licenses, such as an aviation FAA license? Should those be included in these disclosures as well?
Mm. I would say this one is muddy, right? So we have some professions like being a pilot, right? I don't think there are scenarios where you could be employed as a pilot without holding that FAA license. Um, I don't know the specifics of that, so I can't talk about that, but I think that's the general premise. So it is something that's required for employment, and that would be true really across any state or US territory where you're working, as you would have to have this FAA license. On the other hand, it's not issued by a state or territory entity, it's government. There are not specific requirements that are being set by different states that different students would need to adhere to. It really is a national kind of license, it sounds like, if it's issued by FAA. So this, I don't know. This is probably one of the more complicated ones to sort through. Again, the department's intent, if we take a step back from all of this, is to protect students and taxpayers. They want to make sure students can qualify for the license that they need in order to be employed in that profession or occupation in the state or territory where they're located at the time of initial enrollment. Like, that's the premise. And then the taxpayer piece is, right, we want them to be employed so that they can pay back these student loans that they're accessing through Title IV. So again, you'll have to weigh this one. I mean, I think it seems to me like if someone would need a pilot's license in order to work as a pilot, and that's what your program's designed to do, and you're advertising it to do that, even though it's not a state issued license, you may still want to include that as a licensure program and disclose it.
All right. Can we meet the requirements by only admitting state residents to our licensure programs and notifying students that we have only certified compliance in our state? We would check for address changes each year.
So I'm wondering if maybe this one is focused on a scenario where you have a campus-based, face-to-face licensure program. The students that you're admitting will be coming to your campus to take the program, not really commuting across state borders. Like, if we have this scenario, then it is possible that an institution would only make a determination for their state where the institution's located. If all of your students are going to be located in your state as well, right? So you would disclose meets for the state where your institution's located. That's also where all of your students are located per your location policy. And then you would not have an obligation to make determinations for any other state or territory. So Department of Education was pretty clear about that in their commentary they released with these final regulations. They're not placing an obligation for institutions to determine all 59 states and territories. It's only where you're going to be enrolling students from, and again, advertising and recruiting for that licensure program, whatever that exactly is going to mean from the department.
We are unclear about some of these programs that fall in the gray areas and if they are to be listed as does not meet. What if there are modules or online competencies that must be completed prior to licensure? For example, first aid, CPR, or content-specific modules. What about GPA requirements to get licensures that are different than ours? Or someone who cannot get a full license but can get a temporary or provisional license while they take additional coursework?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of good things to be thinking about in this question. I'll start with the last one. So the provisional license, the example that the Department of Education gave around using compacts and reciprocity agreements to help make your determinations was focused on teacher licensing. And it actually specifically was for a scenario where someone who's completed an out-of-state program qualifies for a provisional type license, and then they have to complete, a state-specific history course or something like that that's really unique to that state in order to qualify for the full license. And the department was acknowledging, yes, that is a scenario that we would find acceptable for an institution to make a meets determination. So it's going to depend on the license type and the specifics, right? When you say they qualify for provisional, but if it's for a teacher scenario where they're using the interstate reciprocity agreement as that mechanism to apply, it seems like the department is indicating, yes, that you could say your program meets the educational requirements there. And that would be true if there's even a deficiency, right? Again, if it's kind of a unique course or even something outside of your program, a CPR training, I know you mentioned in the question, that's something that doesn't have to be and is not expected to be in a program of higher education to meet the requirements, right? It's something done outside of the program. So you can say you meet the educational requirements in those scenarios as well if you have those kind of additional modules or trainings, as you call them, things that are not generally expected to be part of a degree program or a certificate program from an institution of higher education. I think I covered that. If I missed part of
I
that,
think so,
Jenny,
yes.
let me know. All right.
We have a few more minutes here, so yes, I'll let you get a drink of water. Your voice must be very tired, Chris.
Yes.
All right. Can you review the steps institutions should be aware in conducting out-of-state elective clinical rotations, board approvals, and the impact on federal financial aid?
Ooh, I'm going to deflect this question because I feel like it's a little out of scope from what we're
Yeah.
talking about today. But I will note that there's another new requirement coming into place for July 1st related to clinical placements, and it's a 45-day window. So institutions have to have a clinical placement. Clinical is, again, kind of a broad term. So that supervised experience placement within 45 days of a student completing the other requirements for the program. So that's probably going to generate some more questions, but it's related to that. There are expectations on you as an institution now related to facilitating those clinical experiences, either in your state or outside of your state, under these Title IV regulations.
All right. For programs that require students to graduate from an accredited program in order to obtain licensure, for example, Doctor of Physical Therapy, an OTD, occupational therapy doctor, etc. How do we enroll students into these programs if the institution is still undergoing its initial accreditation process? Typically, only the first cohort is considered from an accredited program, meaning that the other 2 to 3 cohorts that are enrolled prior to that first cohort graduating are not considered that via the accrediting body or the Department of Ed.
Yeah, you are highlighting a big problem with these new regulations, person who asked that question. So in addition to the licensure requirements, there's another subsection very closely related where institutions must certify through that PPA certification provision that your programs hold any specialized accreditation that's required of the program. So that's another layer on top of this, right? In addition to the fact that for those license types, someone needs to have graduated from an accredited program in order to be eligible for that license, typically. So how do you approach this? I don't know. That's a great question. I don't think the department understood really the processes around accreditation and the fact that for some of these license types, states will not accept a program that's in process or in candidacy for accreditation. So unfortunately, that would be a does not meet scenario. In order to enroll a student who's located in one of those states where you do not meet because the program's not yet fully accredited, they would need to go through the written attestation process, and you'd have to secure a written attestation from them that says they actually want to seek a license and employment in this other state where the program does meet the educational requirements.
Got it. Well, I think we're going to double down on this a little bit here. This one says, for the statement, cannot enroll a student unless located in a meet state. can we get an attestation that recognizes they are in a do not meet, but will come to the does meet location for education?
Come to the does meet location for education. So that's interesting. A little different than planning to seek a license in employment in a does meet. Well, I think, the department has set up this written attestation exception really with a focus on what that student will do after they complete the program, not what they might do during the program. So I'm not sure that that approach would work, that would meet the department's expectations. Really, that written attestation focuses on what they're going to do with that degree after they complete the program, where they're going to seek licensure and employment. But there could be a connection with your question to your student location policy itself. Um, so just think about that too, how you're going to treat particular students that are relocating um, at some point for whatever reason within your program, and you may want to put some language around that in your student location policy.
Great. Well, we are at time here. Thank you again, Chris and Nan. And, I hope your vocal cords get to rest this afternoon, Chris.
Yes, thanks, Jenny. I'm just pointing out a few more slides. You'll get these afterwards. We have some additional resources that we've created for MEC and also on our own website. And then, as I mentioned, WCET SAN's a great resource as well. So you'll have these available to you afterwards. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. So thanks for hosting us, Jenny. Appreciate
You
it.
are so welcome. Thank you, guys. Have a great day, everyone.